The morning
We
sun
must
cast
address the
long
concerns
shadows
of the
across the
people
manicured
immediately.
gardens of
The
Clarence
situation is more
House as
delicate
King
than we
Charles III
anticipated.
stood at his study window, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose bushes that Camilla had planted years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him that on this particular morning, as he prepared to make the most difficult decision of his reign, he found himself staring at the very symbols of their enduring love. Charles had always been a man of duty, shaped by decades of preparation for the crown that now rested heavy on his head. But duty, he was learning, could be a cruel master. The leather-bound folder on his mahogany desk contained documents that would change everything, papers that had arrived via secure courier just 3 days prior from the Prime Minister's office. The contents were explosive enough to topple governments, let alone strain a marriage that had weathered decades of public scrutiny. The king turned from the window, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he reached for the folder. Inside were photographs, financial records, and correspondence that painted a picture he never could have imagined. The woman he had loved for over half a century, the woman he had fought the establishment to marry, the woman who had stood by him through his mother's death and his ascension to the throne, appeared to be at the center of a scandal that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy. Camilla had left early that morning for a charity event in Bath, kissing him goodbye with the same warmth she had shown him since their youth. Her absence now felt like a blessing and a curse. It gave him time to think, to process what he had learned, but it also meant he was alone with thoughts that threatened to consume him. The evidence suggested that Camilla had been secretly funneling money from various royal charities to offshore accounts linked to her first husband, Andrew Parker Bowles. The amounts were staggering, totaling nearly £15 million over the past 5 years. But it wasn't just the money that devastated Charles. It was the suggestion that she had been feeding information about his private conversations to foreign intelligence services, using her position as queen consort to access state secrets that she had no business knowing. Charles sank into his chair, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than ever. He thought back to their early days, when they were young, and the world seemed full of possibilities. He remembered their secret meetings, the stolen moments when he was married to Diana, the years of waiting and hoping that someday they could be together openly. Had it all been a lie? Had she been playing a longer game than he ever imagined? The sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted his thoughts. His private secretary, Sir Edmund Hartley, knocked softly before entering. Edmund had been with the royal household for over 30 years, serving first Queen Elizabeth II and now Charles. He was one of the few people who knew about the investigation that had led to these devastating revelations. "Your Majesty," Edmund said softly, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of concern. "The Prime Minister's office has called again. They need to know your decision by this afternoon. The press has gotten wind of something, though they don't know the details yet. We have perhaps 6 hours before this becomes public." Charles nodded, not trusting his voice. 6 hours to decide whether to protect the woman he loved or protect the institution he had sworn to serve. The monarchy had survived countless scandals over the centuries, but this was different. This struck at the heart of national security, and in an era where public trust in institutions was already fragile, the revelation that the queen consort might be a security risk could be the final blow. "Has there been any word from the security services about the extent of the damage?" Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Edmund shifted uncomfortably. "MI5 believes that sensitive information about your conversations with world leaders may have been compromised. They're particularly concerned about discussions regarding the situation in Ukraine and your private thoughts about various trade agreements. Nothing that would directly endanger lives, but certainly information that could be used to Britain's disadvantage." The king closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of betrayal. These weren't just state secrets that had been compromised. These were his private thoughts, his personal opinions shared in the intimacy of marriage, now potentially in the hands of foreign powers. The violation felt deeply personal, even more so than the financial irregularities. Charles remembered the conversation just last week when he had shared his concerns about a particular trade deal with China. He had been lying in bed next to Camilla, speaking freely as husbands do with their wives, never imagining that his words might be recorded or remembered for purposes other than marital intimacy. Now, those same words might be sitting in a file in Beijing or Moscow, ready to be used against British interests. "There's something else, Your Majesty," Edmund continued, his voice even more subdued. "The investigation has uncovered communications between Her Majesty and her son, Tom Parker Bowles. It appears he may have been aware of at least some of these activities. There's evidence suggesting he helped facilitate some of the financial transfers." Charles felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. Tom had always been like a son to him, a young man he had watched grow up and had welcomed into the family with genuine affection. The idea that he too might be involved in this betrayal added another layer of pain to an already unbearable situation. The irony wasn't lost on Charles that he found himself in a position similar to that of his ancestor, Edward VIII, though the circumstances couldn't have been more different. Edward had chosen love over duty, abdicating the throne for the woman he couldn't live without. Now Charles faced the opposite choice. Duty might require him to abandon the woman he couldn't imagine living without. He thought about the people who would be affected by his decision. William and Catherine, who had worked so hard to modernize the monarchy and make it relevant to younger generations. Harry, with whom his relationship was already strained, and how this scandal might affect any chance of reconciliation. The thousands of people who worked for the various royal charities that Camilla had apparently been pillaging. The British public, who had only recently begun to accept Camilla as their queen. Charles walked to the window again, this time looking out at the London skyline. Somewhere out there, journalists were probably already working on stories, government officials were having urgent meetings, and security services were trying to assess the full extent of the damage. The machinery of crisis management was already in motion, whether he was ready or not. His phone rang, the secure line that connected him directly to the Prime Minister. Charles knew he couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. "Prime Minister," he said as he answered. "Your Majesty, I'm calling to discuss the situation we spoke about yesterday. I need to know how you want to proceed. The security implications are significant, and we need to get ahead of this story before it breaks on its own terms." Charles listened as the Prime Minister outlined the options. They could attempt to contain the story, though that would likely only delay the inevitable and make the eventual revelation worse. They could get ahead of it by making a controlled announcement, though that would mean admitting to security breaches that would embarrass the government. Or they could take the most drastic step of all. "There is another option, Your Majesty," the Prime Minister said carefully. "You could make a statement distancing yourself from the Queen Consort's actions, perhaps suggesting that you were unaware of her activities and that you're taking steps to address the situation." The suggestion hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Charles understood what was being proposed. He could throw Camilla under the bus, paint himself as another victim of her betrayal, and potentially save both his crown and the monarchy itself. It would mean abandoning the woman he loved, but it might be the only way to preserve everything else he held dear. "I need time to think," Charles said finally. "Of course, Your Majesty. But please remember, time is not a luxury we have much of. The story will break with or without our input. It's better to control the narrative than to have it control us." After hanging up, Charles sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking the passage of time toward his deadline. He thought about his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how she had handled the various crises that had plagued the royal family during her reign. The divorces, the scandals, the deaths, and the public relations disasters. She had always found a way to preserve the institution, even when it meant sacrificing individual happiness. But this was different. This wasn't about personal behavior or family dysfunction. This was about potential treason, about the security of the realm, about the very trustworthiness of the crown itself. His mother had never faced anything quite like this. Charles picked up a photograph from his desk, one of him and Camilla at their wedding in 2005. They both looked so happy, so relieved to finally be together officially after decades of waiting. Her smile was radiant, and his own joy was evident in every line of his face. Had that happiness been built on a foundation of lies? Had she been planning even then to use their relationship for purposes he never imagined? The questions tormented him because he realized he might never know the answers. Even if he confronted Camilla directly, how could he trust anything she said? If she had been capable of such an elaborate deception for so long, what reason did he have to believe she would tell him the truth now? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. This time it was his son, William, who entered with the grave expression that had become all too familiar since Charles had taken the throne. William had been briefed on the situation the day before, and Charles could see the strain in his eldest son's face. "Father," William said quietly, taking a seat across from the desk, "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about the decision you have to make." Charles looked at his son, seeing in him both the future of the monarchy and the weight of expectation that came with it. William had always been the responsible one, the one who understood duty and sacrifice from an early age. If anyone could help him navigate this impossible situation, it might be his heir. I keep thinking about what Mother used to say, William continued, referring to Diana, about how important it was to follow your heart, but also about how sometimes the heart and duty point in different directions. The mention of Diana added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Charles had left Diana for Camilla, causing immense public relations damage to the monarchy and personal pain to all involved. Now, the woman he had chosen over duty and public opinion might herself be the greatest threat the monarchy had faced in decades. What do you think I should do? Charles asked his son, genuinely seeking guidance. William was quiet for a long moment, staring out the same window his father had been looking through all morning. I think you have to consider what's best for the country, for the monarchy, and for the family. Not necessarily in that order, but all three. And what about what's best for me? Charles asked, the question sounding selfish even to his own ears. Father, you stopped having the luxury of thinking about what's best for you the moment you became king. That's the burden we all carry in this family. We serve something larger than ourselves. The words stung because they were true. Charles had known this day would come eventually, when his personal desires and his royal duties would come into irreconcilable conflict. He just never imagined it would happen like this, with such devastating personal betrayal at its heart. As William left, Charles returned to the documents spread across his desk. Bank records showing regular transfers to accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Transcripts of conversations between Camilla and unknown contacts. Photographs of meetings that she had never mentioned to him. Evidence of a secret life that had been hidden behind the public facade of their marriage. The most damning piece of evidence was a recording, made by MI5 surveillance, of a phone conversation between Camilla and an unidentified man with a foreign accent. In it, she could be heard discussing Charles's private opinions about various world leaders, including specific comments about the President of France and the German Chancellor. The conversation was brief, but it left no doubt that she was deliberately sharing information that she should have kept confidential. Charles played the recording again, listening to his wife's voice as she casually betrayed his trust. There was no hesitation in her tone, no sign that she felt any guilt about what she was doing. It was as if sharing state secrets was just another part of her daily routine. The sound of cars arriving in the courtyard drew his attention back to the window. Camilla was returning from her charity event, earlier than expected. Charles watched as she emerged from the Bentley, smiling and waving to the small group of photographers who always seemed to be lurking nearby. She looked radiant, completely at ease, showing no sign of the stress that was consuming him. In a few minutes, she would walk through the door of their shared home, kiss him hello, and probably share some amusing story from her day. She would ask about his meetings, inquire about his health, and generally play the role of the devoted wife that she had perfected over the years. The normalcy of it all would be both comforting and devastating. Charles made his decision. He picked up the phone and dialed the Prime Minister's direct line. Prime Minister, this is Charles. I've made my decision about how to proceed with the situation we discussed. Yes, Your Majesty. I want you to prepare a statement. We'll be making an announcement this evening. Camilla entered Clarence's house with the same graceful stride that had carried her through countless royal engagements over the past decades. Her afternoon at the Children's Hospital in Bath had been particularly rewarding, and she was eager to share the day's highlights with Charles. The young patients had been delightful, especially a 7-year-old named Sophie who had drawn her a picture of the royal corgis wearing tiny crowns. As she made her way to Charles's study, Camilla noticed an unusual stillness in the house. The staff seemed more subdued than usual, their usual friendly greetings replaced with polite nods and averted eyes. She attributed it to the natural ebb and flow of household moods and thought nothing more of it. She found Charles standing by his desk, his back turned to the door. The late afternoon light streaming through the windows cast him in silhouette, making him appear smaller and more fragile than usual. At 74, he had been showing the strain of kingship more obviously in recent months, and Camilla had been gently encouraging him to delegate more responsibilities to William. Darling, she said warmly, approaching him with the same easy affection that had characterized their relationship for over 50 years. You'll never guess what happened today at the hospital. There was this little girl. Charles turned slowly to face her, and Camilla's words died in her throat. His expression was unlike anything she had seen before, not even during the darkest days following his mother's death. His eyes, usually warm and kind, were cold and distant, as if he were looking at a stranger. Charles, she said uncertainly, her hand instinctively reaching out toward him. What's wrong? Has something happened? For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with intention that Camilla couldn't understand. She noticed the documents scattered across his desk, the serious-looking folders that suggested official business of the gravest kind. We need to talk, Charles said finally, his voice formal and distant. It was the tone he used with difficult politicians or hostile journalists, not the voice of a husband speaking to his wife. Of course, Camilla replied, though her heart was beginning to race. Charles, you're frightening me. What's this about? Instead of answering, Charles gestured to the chair across from his desk. The same chair where she had sat countless times over the years, sharing tea and conversation, planning their schedules, discussing everything from state dinners to grandchildren's birthdays. Now it felt like being summoned to a tribunal. Camilla sat down slowly, her mind racing through the events of the past few days, trying to understand what could have caused such a dramatic change in her husband's demeanor. She had been careful, so very careful, for so many years. How could this be happening now? Charles remained standing, which made the power dynamic in the room uncomfortably clear. He was the king, and she was a subject about to be judged. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I received some disturbing information 3 days ago. Charles began, his voice measured and controlled. Information that concerns activities you've been involved in without my knowledge. Camilla's mouth went dry. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, though every instinct told her to look away. I don't understand. What activities? Charles picked up one of the folders from his desk and opened it. 15 million pounds, Camilla. 15 million pounds diverted from royal charities to offshore accounts linked to Andrew. The blood drained from Camilla's face. She gripped the arms of her chair, trying to steady herself as the room seemed to spin slightly. This was the conversation she had always known might come someday, the reckoning she had hoped to avoid indefinitely. Charles, I can explain, she began, but he held up a hand to silence her. I'm not finished, he said coldly. The money is just the beginning. There are recordings, Camilla. Recordings of you sharing details of my private conversations with foreign contacts. State secrets, personal opinions, confidential discussions about other world leaders. Each word hit Camilla like a physical blow. The carefully constructed wall between her public life and her secret activities was crumbling around her. She had always known the risks, but the rewards had seemed to justify them. The money had been secondary. It was the thrill of the game, the sense of power that came from manipulating events from behind the scenes. How long? Charles asked, his voice barely controlled. How long have you been doing this? Camilla closed her eyes, trying to find the words that might salvage the situation. But she was tired, so very tired of living a double life. Perhaps it was time for the truth, at least part of it. It started small, she said quietly. Years ago, before we were married, Andrew had gotten into some financial difficulties, gambling debts that could have been embarrassing for both of us. Someone approached me, offered to help in exchange for small favors. Information about your schedule, your mood, little things that seemed harmless. Charles's face darkened. Someone approached you? Who? I never knew their real names. Camilla lied smoothly. They were professionals, very careful about operational security. At first, it really was just harmless information. But, gradually, they asked for more. And you gave it to them. It wasn't a question. Yes, Camilla whispered. Yes, I gave it to them. Charles turned away from her, staring out the window again. The gardens that had seemed so peaceful that morning now looked like a prison yard, the high walls and security cameras suddenly more prominent than the flowers. Do you have any idea what you've done? He asked. Not just to me, not just to us, but to the country, to the monarchy, to everything we've both spent our lives serving. Camilla stood up abruptly, anger flashing through her fear. Don't lecture me about service, Charles. Don't you dare. I've served this family, this institution, for decades. I've endured public humiliation, press attacks, and constant scrutiny. I've smiled and waved and played the perfect royal wife while the world called me names and questioned my worth. So this was revenge? Charles asked, turning back to face her. Payback for the difficulties you faced when we got together? It was survival, Camilla snapped. You have no idea what it's like to be constantly judged, constantly found wanting. The money gave me independence, a sense of security that I could never get from being your wife. And the information, it gave me power. For once in my life, I wasn't just a supporting character in someone else's story. The admission hung in the air between them like poison gas. Charles stared at his wife as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The woman he had loved, The woman he had sacrificed so much for, the woman he had thought he knew completely, was revealing herself to be a stranger. How much? He asked quietly. How much did they pay you? Camilla lifted her chin defiantly. Over the years? About 20 million pounds, not counting what I've shared with Andrew and Tom. Tom knows. Charles felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Your son is involved in this. He helped with some of the financial arrangements, Camilla said defensively. He's my son, Charles. I wasn't going to let him struggle financially when I had the means to help him. Charles sank into his chair, the weight of betrayal almost too much to bear. It wasn't just Camilla who had been living a lie. It was her entire family. People he had welcomed into his home, people he had trusted and cared for, had been systematically betraying him for years. Why? He asked. And, for the first time since the conversation began, his voice cracked with emotion. Why, Camilla? We could have worked through any financial problems. You never had to do this. Camilla softened slightly, hearing the pain in his voice. For a moment, she remembered the young man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, the vulnerable prince who had needed her strength and support. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the hard pragmatism that had guided her secret life. Because I could, she said simply. Because for once, I had something that was mine alone. Do you know what it's like to live your entire adult life in someone else's shadow? To be constantly compared to a dead saint? To have every move you make scrutinized and criticized? That's what you signed up for when you married me, Charles said harshly. That's what this life entails. Easy words from someone who was born to it, Camilla retorted. You've never had to prove your worth, never had to justify your existence. You just had to be born. The bitterness in her voice cut through Charles like a knife. This was the woman he had chosen over duty, over public opinion, over his first marriage. This was the great love of his life, revealing herself to be motivated by resentment and greed. A knock at the door interrupted their confrontation. Edmund entered with obvious reluctance, his usual composure clearly strained. Your Majesty, he said carefully, not looking at Camilla. The Prime Minister is here. He says the matter we discussed cannot wait any longer. Charles nodded grimly. Send him in. The Prime Minister entered with the bearing of a man carrying bad news. He glanced briefly at Camilla, then focused his attention entirely on Charles. Your Majesty, I'm afraid the situation has escalated. We've received intelligence that suggests the information leak may have compromised ongoing security operations. There are also indications that other members of the royal household may be under surveillance by foreign intelligence services. Camilla felt the room closing in around her. This had gone far beyond what she had ever intended. The people who had recruited her so many years ago had assured her that the information would be used only for economic advantage, never for anything that would truly harm British interests. What are you saying? Charles asked. We believe that Her Majesty's contacts may have used the intelligence she provided to identify and potentially compromise British assets overseas. There's at least one case where we think a deep-cover operative may have been exposed. The blood drained from Camilla's face completely. She had never intended for anyone to be hurt. The game she had been playing suddenly felt very real and very dangerous. That's impossible, she said quickly. They promised me the information would never be used for anything like that. The Prime Minister looked at her with barely concealed contempt. Your Majesty, I'm afraid the people who made you those promises were not known for their honesty. Charles stood up slowly, his decision crystallizing in his mind. What do you need from me? We need a clear statement that distances the crown from these activities, the Prime Minister said carefully. We need to demonstrate that the monarchy was unaware of what was happening and is taking decisive action to address the security breach. Camilla understood immediately what was being proposed. They wanted Charles to throw her to the wolves, to sacrifice her to save the institution. She looked at her husband, searching his face for some sign that he would fight for her, that their decades together meant something more than political expediency. But Charles's expression remained cold and determined. The man looking at her now was not her husband. He was the King of England, making a calculation about what was best for his realm. I need to speak with my wife privately, Charles said to the Prime Minister. Give us 10 minutes. The Prime Minister nodded and left, closing the door behind him. Charles and Camilla stared at each other across a divide that seemed to grow wider with each passing second. You're going to abandon me, Camilla said. It wasn't a question. You abandoned us first, Charles replied. You abandoned our marriage, our family, our country. You've been living a lie for years, possibly decades. I loved you, Camilla said desperately. Whatever else I did, I loved you. That was never a lie. Charles was quiet for a long moment, and When he spoke, his voice was infinitely sad. I don't know if I can believe anything you tell me anymore. How can I trust that your love was real when everything else was false? Camilla moved toward him, reaching out as if to touch his face, but Charles stepped back. The rejection was like a physical blow. What happens now? She asked. Charles looked at the woman who had been the center of his world for so long, trying to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the stranger standing before him. Now, he said quietly, you disappear. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Camilla stared at Charles, waiting for him to soften, to take back what he had just said, to remember the decades of love and companionship they had shared. But his expression remained resolute, carved from stone. You can't be serious, she whispered. Charles, we can work through this. We've survived worse scandals than this. Have we? Charles asked coldly. When have we ever faced treason charges? When have we ever had to worry about British intelligence operatives being compromised because of pillow talk? Camilla sank back into her chair, the full magnitude of her situation finally becoming clear. This wasn't just about embarrassing headlines or uncomfortable questions from the press. This was about the fundamental security of the realm, and she had placed herself on the wrong side of that equation. What exactly are you proposing? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Charles moved to his desk and picked up a document that had been prepared while she was away. The palace will announce that you are stepping back from all royal duties immediately due to health concerns. You will retire from public life completely. Your titles will be reviewed. Reviewed? Camilla's voice cracked. What does that mean? It means they will likely be revoked, Charles said bluntly. The Queen Consort title, the Order of the Garter, everything. You'll retain your personal honors from before our marriage, but nothing connected to the crown. Camilla felt as if she were drowning. The titles, the position, the respect that came with being Queen Consort, these had become integral parts of her identity. The thought of losing them was almost as devastating as losing Charles himself. And us? She asked quietly. What about our marriage? Charles was silent for a long time, staring out the window again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I don't know. I honestly don't know if there is an us anymore. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and for the first time since the conversation began, Camilla saw glimpses of the man she had married rather than the king who was judging her. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold determination that duty demanded. The children need to be told, Charles continued, referring to William and Harry, as well as Camilla's own children. They'll hear about it soon enough anyway, and it's better they understand the situation before the press gets hold of it. Camilla thought about her children, Tom and Laura, who had worked so hard to build their own lives and careers away from the royal spotlight. This scandal would drag them back into the public eye in the worst possible way, subjecting them to scrutiny and criticism that could destroy everything they had built. Will they be safe? She asked. My children, I mean. Are they in any legal jeopardy? Charles consulted another document from his desk. Tom certainly is. His involvement in the financial arrangements makes him an accessory at minimum. Laura appears to have been uninvolved, though she'll undoubtedly be questioned. The reality of what she had done to her family was beginning to sink in. It wasn't just her own life that was being destroyed by her choices. She had potentially ruined her son's life as well. The guilt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with a strange sense of relief. The constant vigilance, the careful management of her double life, the fear of discovery, all of it could finally end. How long do I have? She asked. The announcement will be made tomorrow morning, Charles replied. You'll need to be gone before then. Gone where? That's up to you. The security services have some suggestions, places where you can disappear quietly without creating an international incident. There are also some conditions about future contact with certain people and organizations. Camilla understood. She was being offered exile instead of prosecution, disappearance instead of disgrace. It was more generous than she had any right to expect, and she knew it was probably the best deal she was going to get. Can I see the children? To say goodbye? Charles considered this. Supervised visits might be possible after things settle down, but not immediately, and not here. A knock at the door interrupted them. This time it was William who entered, looking grim but determined. He nodded to his father, then turned to Camilla with an expression she had never seen before, cold and disappointed. Camilla, he said formally, Father's told me about the situation. William, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. I'm not here to listen to explanations or apologies, he said curtly. I'm here to discuss the practical arrangements for your departure and the protection of the family reputation. The formality was devastating. This was a young man she had helped raise, someone she had considered a son. Now he was speaking to her like a courtier addressing a disgraced noble. The children have been briefed, William continued. Charlotte and Louis don't understand the details, but they know you won't be around anymore. George is old enough to understand more, and he's taking it hard. Camilla's heart broke a little more. She had grown genuinely fond of William and Catherine's children, and the thought of never seeing them again was almost unbearable. They would grow up thinking of her as the grandmother who had betrayed their family, if they thought of her at all. Catherine sends her regards, William said carefully, the pause making it clear that the message was more diplomatic than heartfelt. She's focusing on helping the children process this change. Charles watched this exchange with visible pain. Whatever else Camilla had done, she had been a loving stepmother and grandmother. The collateral damage to family relationships was perhaps the cruelest consequence of her betrayal. Harry has been informed as well, William continued. He's flying in from California tomorrow to help manage the situation. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Harry, who had been estranged from the family for years, was returning to help deal with a scandal that might make his own controversial decisions seem minor by comparison. The press strategy is being finalized, Williams said, addressing his father rather than Camilla. We're coordinating with the government to ensure a unified response. The focus will be on your decisive action to address the security breach and protect the integrity of the crown. Camilla listened to them discuss her fate as if she weren't in the room. The woman who had once been queen consort was being erased from the royal narrative with clinical efficiency. In a few days, it would be as if she had never existed. What about our personal belongings? She asked suddenly. Our shared possessions, the things from our life together? Charles looked pained. You can take your personal items, of course. Jewelry that was yours before our marriage, clothing, photographs that are purely personal. But anything connected to your role as queen consort will remain here. Camilla thought about the years of accumulated memories, the gifts from world leaders, the ceremonial items that had marked significant moments in their shared life. All of it would disappear, erased from history along with her title and position. The engagement ring, she said quietly. The one that belonged to your grandmother. Charles closed his eyes briefly. That was a royal heirloom. It needs to stay with the family. The symbolism was devastating. The ring that had marked their engagement, that she had worn for nearly 2 decades, would be returned as if their marriage had never happened. She pulled it from her finger slowly, the metal feeling impossibly heavy, and placed it on Charles's desk. Edmund appeared in the doorway again, clearly uncomfortable with his role in these proceedings. Your Majesty, the Prime Minister needs to finalize the statement. He's waiting in the blue drawing room. Charles nodded, then turned to his wife for what they both knew might be the last time they spoke as husband and wife. Do you have any questions about the arrangements? Camilla shook her head, not trusting her voice. There were 1,000 things she wanted to say, explanations she wanted to offer, memories she wanted to revisit, but none of it would change anything now. The damage was done, and the consequences were unfolding with the inexorable force of destiny. I need to go, Charles said softly. The car will be here at 6 tomorrow morning to take you to the airport. Everything has been arranged. He moved toward the door, then stopped, and turned back to her one final time. For a moment, the mask slipped, and she could see the pain and confusion of a man who had lost the woman he loved to circumstances he never could have imagined. I hope you find peace, Camilla, he said quietly. Despite everything that's happened, I hope you find some measure of peace. Then, he was gone, leaving her alone in the study that had been the scene of so many important moments in their life together. Camilla sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the household continuing around her, people carrying on with their duties as if her world hadn't just ended. She thought about packing, about choosing which fragments of her life she would take with her into exile. But the task seemed overwhelming, and she found herself paralyzed by the magnitude of what she was losing. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Laura, her daughter, standing in the doorway with tears in her eyes. Mom, Laura said tentatively. Are you all right? Camilla almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Was she all right? Her marriage was over, her title was gone, her stepchildren wanted nothing to do with her, and she was about to disappear into exile. But seeing her daughter's concerned face reminded her that not everything in her life had been a lie. Come here, darling, she said, opening her arms to Laura. They held each other in the darkening room, both of them crying silently. Laura didn't ask for explanations or details. She simply offered her mother the comfort of her presence. "Where will you go?" Laura asked finally. "I don't know yet," Camilla replied honestly. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can try to make sense of what I've done. Will I be able to see you?" Camilla stroked her daughter's hair, remembering doing the same thing when Laura was a little girl with scraped knees and broken toys. "I hope so. Maybe not right away, but someday." They talked quietly as the evening deepened, avoiding the topic that had brought them to this moment, and instead focusing on memories of happier times. Laura helped her mother begin the painful process of sorting through possessions, deciding what was essential and what could be left behind. As they worked, Camilla found herself telling Laura things she had never shared before. Stories about her childhood, about her first meeting with Charles, about the years when they couldn't be together publicly. She edited out the darker parts of the story, the secret activities that had led to this catastrophe, but she gave her daughter a glimpse into the woman she had been before she became queen consort. "I want you to remember something," Camilla said as they folded clothes into a small suitcase. "Whatever you hear about me in the coming weeks and months, remember that I loved your father, and I love you and Tom more than my own life. The choices I made were wrong, but they weren't motivated by a lack of love for my family." Laura nodded through her tears. "I know, Mom. I know you love us." But even as she said the words, Camilla wondered if love was enough to justify what she had done. She had loved Charles, but she had betrayed him. She loved her children, but she had put them in jeopardy. Perhaps love wasn't the pure, redemptive force she had always believed it to be. As midnight approached, Laura finally left, promising to return in the morning to see her mother off. Camilla was alone again, surrounded by the remnants of a life that was ending. She picked up the framed photograph of her and Charles from his desk, studying their younger faces and trying to remember what it felt like to be truly happy. Tomorrow, she would disappear from public view, becoming just another footnote in the long history of royal scandals. The woman who had waited decades to become queen consort would vanish as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving behind only questions and regrets. But tonight, in the quiet of the study where she had shared so many moments with the man she had loved and lost, Camilla allowed herself to grieve for the life that might have been. Dawn broke gray and somber over London, matching the mood that had settled over Clarence's house like a funeral shroud. Charles had not slept, instead spending the long hours of the night walking through rooms filled with memories of the woman who would soon disappear from his life forever. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every casual reminder of their shared existence felt like a knife wound. At precisely 6 o'clock, a black sedan arrived at the private entrance to Clarence's house. The driver was a government agent, part of the careful choreography designed to ensure that Camilla's departure would attract no attention from the press or public. Charles watched from his bedroom window as his wife's luggage was loaded into the trunk, two small suitcases containing the remnants of a life that had once encompassed palaces and state occasions. Camilla emerged from the house dressed simply in a navy coat and dark glasses, looking like any other woman of her age heading to the airport. But Charles could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held herself together despite the magnitude of what she was leaving behind. Even in disgrace, even in betrayal, she maintained the dignity that had first attracted him to her all those years ago. Laura was with her, holding her mother's arm protectively as they walked to the car. Tom had arrived an hour earlier, but had left through a different exit, accompanied by his own government handler. The family was being scattered like seeds in the wind, each member facing an uncertain future shaped by choices that seemed increasingly unreal in the morning light. Charles wanted to go down to say goodbye, to offer some final word of comfort or closure, but his security detail had advised against it. The fewer people who witnessed Camilla's departure, the better for everyone involved. Instead, he remained at his window, a silent observer of the end of his marriage. As the car pulled away, Charles felt something inside him break that he wasn't sure could ever be repaired. The woman disappearing into the London traffic wasn't just his wife. She was the repository of half a century of shared experiences, the person who knew his fears and dreams better than anyone else in the world. Whatever she had done, whatever lies she had told, she had also been his closest companion through the most difficult period of his life. The breakfast room felt impossibly empty when Charles finally forced himself to go downstairs. The morning newspapers were laid out as usual, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them. By evening, every major news outlet in the world would be carrying the story of Camilla's sudden withdrawal from public life, and the speculation would begin immediately. Edmund appeared with the day's schedule, though both men knew that most appointments would need to be cancelled or postponed. The immediate priority was damage control, managing the narrative before it spiraled beyond their ability to influence it. The Prime Minister will be here at 9, Edmund reported. The Archbishop of Canterbury at 10, and the Leader of the Opposition at 11. The children have requested a family meeting at 2. Charles nodded, though the thought of facing his sons and explaining the full extent of the situation filled him with dread. Harry had arrived late the previous night, and Charles could only imagine the conversations that had taken place between the brothers as they processed the latest family crisis. The Prime Minister arrived precisely on time, bringing with him the final version of the statement that would reshape British history. The language was carefully neutral, expressing concern for Camilla's health while avoiding any direct mention of the activities that had necessitated her departure. The Queen Consort has made the difficult decision to step back from all royal duties in order to focus on her health and personal well-being, the statement read. His Majesty the King supports her decision and asks for privacy during this challenging time for the royal family. It was masterfully crafted, offering just enough information to satisfy immediate curiosity while leaving room for alternative interpretations. Those who suspected the truth would read between the lines, but the general public might genuinely believe that Camilla was suffering from some undisclosed medical condition. The security implications are being handled separately, the Prime Minister explained. MI5 is conducting a full damage assessment, and we're working with our allies to identify any ongoing threats. The Financial Crimes Unit is also investigating the charity fraud, though they'll coordinate with us on timing and public statements. Charles listened to these discussions with a growing sense of unreality. His private life was being dissected and managed by teams of experts. His personal tragedy transformed into a matter of national security and public relations. The Crown demanded such sacrifices, but knowing that didn't make them any easier to bear. The Archbishop of Canterbury's visit was perhaps the most difficult of the morning. As the senior cleric of the Church of England, he needed to understand the religious implications of the king's marital situation. The Church had blessed Charles and Camilla's marriage, and the dissolution of that union raised complex theological and constitutional questions. Your Majesty, the Archbishop said gently, I want you to know that whatever personal struggles you're facing, the Church stands ready to support you. These are not easy times, but they are times that test our faith and our commitment to doing what is right. Charles appreciated the man's discretion in not pressing for details, though they both knew that the Archbishop would be briefed on the security implications separately. The conversation focused instead on the pastoral needs of the moment, the importance of maintaining dignity in crisis, and the long tradition of the monarchy surviving personal scandals through adherence to duty and service. The family meeting that afternoon was the most difficult encounter Charles had faced since becoming king. William and Harry sat across from him in the same drawing room where he had spent so many happy hours with Camilla, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern, disappointment, and determination. Harry spoke first, his voice carefully controlled despite the obvious strain he was under. Dad, we need to understand what we're dealing with here. The official statement talks about health issues, but the security briefing we received paints a very different picture. Charles looked at his younger son, noting how much he had matured since leaving royal life. The man sitting before him bore little resemblance to the troubled young prince who had struggled with his role in the family. Adversity, it seemed, had given Harry a strength and clarity that Charles envied. The situation is complicated, Charles began, then stopped himself. His sons deserved the truth, or as much of it as he could share without compromising ongoing investigations. Camilla made some very poor decisions over many years. Decisions that put her in contact with people who don't have Britain's best interests at heart. William leaned forward, his expression grave. How bad is it? Are we looking at criminal charges? Possibly, Charles admitted. The financial irregularities alone could result in fraud charges. The security implications are more serious, but those are being handled through different channels. Harry shook his head slowly. I can't believe she would do this. I mean, I know we've had our differences with Camilla over the years, but this seems completely out of character. People are capable of surprises, Charles said quietly. Sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones hiding the most secrets. The irony of Harry making such a statement wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Harry himself had surprised the family with his decision to leave royal life, though his choices had been motivated by a desire for independence rather than greed or betrayal. What happens now? William asked. Not just with the investigation, but with the family. How do we move forward from this? Charles wished he had a good answer to that question. The constitutional monarchy would survive, as it always had, but the personal cost was still being calculated. His relationship with his sons would undoubtedly be affected, and the public's trust in the royal family would take another significant blow. We focus on service, Charles said finally. We remember why this institution exists and what it's meant to accomplish. We work to rebuild trust through our actions, not our words. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical matters like security arrangements, media strategy, and the redistribution of royal duties that Camilla had been handling. Throughout it all, Charles was struck by his son's maturity and commitment to the family despite everything that had happened. As they prepared to leave, Harry approached his father with an expression of genuine concern. Dad, are you going to be all right? I mean, personally, this can't be easy for you. Charles felt his composure slip slightly. In all the discussions about security breaches and constitutional crises, few people had asked about his emotional well-being. The man behind the crown was grieving the loss of his marriage, struggling with feelings of betrayal and abandonment that no amount of royal training had prepared him for. I'll manage, Charles said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. I have to. Harry put a hand on his father's shoulder. You don't have to manage alone. William and we're here for you. Whatever our differences have been in the past, family comes first when it really matters. The gesture of support nearly broke Charles's remaining composure. He nodded gratefully, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak. That evening, after the last meeting had ended and the staff had withdrawn to give him privacy, Charles found himself in the study where his confrontation with Camilla had taken place. The room felt different now, emptied of the warmth and companionship that had defined it for so many years. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had memorized decades ago but had rarely used. After several rings, a familiar voice answered. Charles, is that really you? Hello, and he said to his sister. I was wondering if you might have time to talk. Princess and had always been the most pragmatic member of the royal family, the one who cut through emotional complexity with sharp insight and practical solutions. She had never particularly liked Camilla, though she had been diplomatically supportive of the marriage. Now, Charles found himself needing her particular brand of frank wisdom. I've been expecting this call, and said without preamble. I assume you need someone to talk to who isn't a government official or a security expert. Something like that. Well, come over then. We'll have some whiskey, and you can tell me what really happened. An hour later, Charles found himself in Anne's comfortable sitting room, a glass of single malt in his hand, and his sister's direct gaze forcing him to confront the full emotional reality of what he had lost, and listened without interruption as he told her about the evidence, the confrontation, and the impossible choice between personal loyalty and royal duty. You did the right thing, and said when he finished. You know that, don't you? Do I? Charles asked. I threw away 50 years of love and companionship. I abandoned the woman I fought to marry, the woman I chose over duty once before. You chose duty over betrayal, and corrected firmly. There's a difference. Love doesn't excuse treason, Charles. It never has, and it never will. Charles knew his sister was right, but the knowledge didn't ease the pain of loss. He had spent his entire adult life learning to balance personal desires with royal obligations, but nothing had prepared him for a situation where those two imperatives were so completely irreconcilable. The hardest part, he admitted, is that I still love her. Despite everything she's done, despite the lies and the betrayal, I still love her. How do I reconcile that with what I know about her? And considered this question carefully before responding. Maybe you don't have to reconcile it. Maybe love and disappointment can coexist. People are complicated, Charles. They're capable of genuine affection and terrible betrayal at the same time. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, brother and sister united in their shared understanding of the burdens that came with royal birth, and had never married for love, having chosen instead partners who understood and accepted the constraints of royal life. Charles had taken the more romantic path, and now he was paying the price for that choice. What will you tell history about her? And asked eventually. Charles considered the question. I suppose I'll tell them she served with dignity for as long as she was able, that she supported the monarchy and performed her duties conscientiously, that she was a loving stepmother and grandmother, and the rest of it will be classified for 50 years, if we're lucky. Maybe by then, it won't matter as much. As Charles prepared to leave Anne's house, She offered him one final piece of advice. Don't spend the rest of your life trying to understand why she did it. You'll drive yourself mad looking for explanations that might not exist. Focus on what comes next, not what's already finished. The drive back to Clarence's house took Charles through the streets of London, past the landmarks that had defined his life since childhood. The city looked the same as it had that morning, but everything had changed for the man who ruled over it. He was returning to a house that would never again feel like a home, to a life that would never again include the woman who had been its center. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises to manage, new duties to perform. But tonight, Charles allowed himself to grieve for what he had lost, for the future that would never be, and for the love that had ended not in death, but in betrayal. 6 months had passed since Camilla's disappearance from public life, and the initial media frenzy had gradually subsided into occasional speculation and conspiracy theories. The official story of health concerns had largely held, though investigative journalists continued to probe for deeper truths. Charles had aged visibly during this period, the strain of maintaining public composure while privately grieving evident to those who knew him well. The secure phone in his private study rang at precisely 3 a.m., jolting Charles from the restless sleep that had become his norm. Only a handful of people had access to this line, and calls at such an hour invariably meant crisis or catastrophe. Your Majesty, the voice belonged to Sir Marcus Thornfield, the head of MI6. I'm calling to inform you that we've received intelligence regarding your wife's current situation. Charles sat up in bed, his heart rate immediately accelerating. In the months since Camilla's departure, he had received only minimal updates about her whereabouts and well-being. The security services had deemed it safer for everyone involved if the king maintained plausible deniability about her location and activities. Go on, Charles said, though he dreaded what he might hear. She's in Switzerland, Your Majesty, a small town near Lake Geneva. She's been living under an assumed name, but our sources indicate that her health has deteriorated significantly over the past month. The words hit Charles like a physical blow. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the betrayal and the necessary separation, Camilla was still the woman he had loved for over 5 decades. The thought of her suffering alone in exile was almost unbearable. How deteriorated? He asked quietly. The medical details are sketchy, but it appears to be serious. Our contact suggests that she may not have long to live. Charles closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of impossible choices settling over him once again. As king, he couldn't afford to be seen as soft on security threats or compromised by personal feelings. But, as a man, the idea of allowing his wife to die alone and forgotten was unconscionable. Is she asking for anything? Any contact with family? No, Your Majesty. In fact, our intelligence suggests she specifically refused all attempts at contact. She seems determined to maintain the separation she agreed to when she left. Charles understood the logic of Camilla's position, but it didn't make the situation any easier to accept. She was protecting him, protecting the monarchy, even as she faced her final months in isolation. It was perhaps the most selfless thing she had done in years, and the irony wasn't lost on him. What are my options? Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Officially? None. Any contact between you and her could be seen as a security risk and would certainly become public knowledge. The press is still watching for any sign that the official story about her withdrawal was incomplete. And unofficially? Sir Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding. If you were to take a private holiday, perhaps to visit old friends in Europe, it's possible that certain arrangements could be made. Nothing official, nothing traceable, but perhaps a brief meeting could be facilitated. Charles felt a surge of gratitude toward the intelligence chief, who was offering to risk his own career to provide the king with a chance at closure. It was the kind of personal loyalty that Charles had always valued but never took for granted. I need to think about this, Charles said. How much time do we have? Our medical assessment suggests weeks rather than months. If you're going to make contact, it should be soon. After ending the call, Charles lay awake for the remainder of the night, wrestling with a decision that would have been impossible for any ordinary person but was even more complex for a reigning monarch. Every choice he made had implications that extended far beyond his personal feelings, affecting the stability of the crown and the security of the realm. By morning, he had reached a decision that surprised even himself. 3 days later, Charles found himself on a private jet bound for Geneva, traveling under the cover of a cultural visit to examine medieval manuscripts at a private foundation. The official schedule included meetings with Swiss officials and a dinner with prominent British expatriates. But the real purpose of the trip was known only to a select few. William had been quietly informed of the journey's true nature and had offered to accompany his father, but Charles had declined. This was something he needed to do alone, a final reckoning with the woman who had shaped so much of his adult life. Harry had been more conflicted about the trip, arguing that it represented an unnecessary security risk for what he characterized as emotional indulgence. The debate between his sons had revealed different perspectives on duty, forgiveness, and the nature of love itself. William, perhaps influenced by his own strong marriage, had argued that Charles deserved closure regardless of Camilla's crimes. Harry, still carrying scars from his own family traumas, had questioned whether forgiveness was possible when trust had been so completely violated. Charles understood both viewpoints, but found himself driven by something deeper than either duty or logic. After 50 years together, he needed to look into Camilla's eyes one more time, to understand if the woman he had loved had ever truly existed or if she had been an elaborate fiction designed to manipulate him. The safe house was located in a small village overlooking Lake Geneva, the kind of anonymous location where wealthy individuals could disappear without attracting attention. Charles was driven there in an unmarked car by a Swiss intelligence officer who spoke perfect English, but revealed nothing about how he had come to be involved in such a delicate operation. The house itself was modest but comfortable, with large windows offering spectacular views of the lake and surrounding mountains. It was the kind of place where Camilla would once have planned charity events or hosted intimate dinners for friends. Now it served as a prison, albeit a comfortable one. She was waiting in the sitting room when Charles arrived, and the sight of her nearly broke his composure entirely. The woman who had once commanded rooms with her presence now seemed almost fragile, diminished by illness and isolation. But her eyes still held the intelligence and strength that had first attracted him to her decades earlier. "Hello, Charles," she said quietly, rising from her chair with obvious effort. "I wasn't sure you would come." "I wasn't sure either," he replied honestly, standing awkwardly in the doorway like a nervous teenager on his first date. They looked at each other across the room, two people who had shared everything and now shared nothing except a complicated history. The months of separation had made them strangers to each other, but the decades of intimacy couldn't be erased entirely. "You look tired," Camilla said, gesturing for him to sit down. "The crown suits you, but it's taking a toll." Charles took the offered seat, noting how easily they fell back into the comfortable patterns of their long relationship. Despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayal and the separation, she still knew him better than almost anyone else in the world. "How are you feeling?" he asked, though her appearance had already provided much of the answer. "Like someone who made terrible choices and is paying the price for them," she said with a rueful smile. "The doctors tell me I have perhaps a month, maybe 2 if I'm lucky. Cancer, ironically enough. Nothing exotic or mysterious, just the ordinary disease that takes ordinary people." The matter-of-fact way she discussed her impending death was both heartbreaking and admirable. Camilla had always been practical about life's realities, but facing mortality with such equanimity required a particular kind of courage. "I'm sorry," Charles said, and he meant it. Whatever she had done, however, she had betrayed him. He had never wanted her to suffer like this. "Don't be sorry for me," Camilla replied firmly. "Be sorry for what I did to you, to the family, to the country. But don't waste your sympathy on someone who brought this on herself." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the late afternoon light play across the lake. It was the kind of peaceful scene they might have enjoyed together under different circumstances, perhaps during a private holiday away from the pressures of royal life. "Why did you do it?" Charles asked finally, the question that had tormented him for months. Camilla was quiet for a long time, staring out at the water as if the answer might be found in its depths. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Because I could. Because it made me feel powerful in a world where I was constantly reminded of my inadequacies. Because it gave me something that was mine alone, separate from your world and your expectations." She turned to look at him directly. "I never intended for it to go as far as it did. It started as small favors, harmless information that seemed insignificant. But each compromise made the next one easier, until I was so deep in it that I couldn't see a way out." "Did you ever love me?" Charles asked, the question that went to the heart of everything. "Or was it all part of the game?" Camilla's eyes filled with tears. "I loved you more than my own life. That was never a lie, never a performance." The other things I did, they were separate from what I felt for you. I know that probably doesn't make sense, but people are capable of holding contradictory truths simultaneously. Charles wanted to believe her, needed to believe that their decades together had been built on genuine emotion rather than calculated deception. But trust, once broken so completely, was not easily restored. I kept telling myself that what I was doing wasn't really hurting anyone, Camilla continued. The financial arrangements seemed like victimless crimes, just moving money around on paper. The information sharing felt like gossip rather than espionage. I compartmentalized everything so thoroughly that I lost sight of the bigger picture. Until it was too late, Charles said. Until it was too late, she agreed. By the time I realized how serious it had become, I was trapped. They had enough evidence to destroy not just me, but Tom as well. Laura too, if they wanted to be vindictive. I kept going because stopping seemed more dangerous than continuing. Charles began to understand the psychology that had driven his wife's choices. Fear had motivated her as much as greed or power, creating a vicious cycle that became increasingly difficult to escape. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it made her actions more comprehensible. What happens to Tom? Charles asked. And Laura? Tom will likely face charges, though his lawyers think they can negotiate something manageable. A few years in minimum security, perhaps, with restitution for the money he helped launder. Laura is completely clear, thank God. She never knew anything about what we were doing. The relief in Camilla's voice when she spoke about her daughter was evident. Whatever else she had sacrificed to her secret life, she had protected Laura from involvement or knowledge. It was perhaps the only entirely unselfish thing she had managed to do throughout the entire affair. Do they hate me? Charles asked. Your children? Camilla smiled sadly. Tom is angry, which is understandable since my choices have destroyed his life. But, Laura, she's disappointed and hurt, but she still loves me. She visits when she can, though it's difficult with all the security arrangements. They talked for another hour, covering practical matters, and shared memories with equal weight. Charles found himself remembering why he had fallen in love with this woman, her intelligence and wit still evident despite her illness. But he also remained acutely aware of how thoroughly she had deceived him, how the person he thought he knew had been only one facet of a much more complex and troubled individual. As the sun began to set over the lake, Charles knew it was time to leave. The longer he stayed, the greater the risk to both of them. But he found himself reluctant to end what would almost certainly be their final conversation. I need to ask you something, Camilla said as he prepared to go. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? Not publicly, not officially, but personally. In your heart. Charles considered the question carefully. Forgiveness implied a letting go of anger and resentment, but it didn't require forgetting or excusing what had happened. It was about freeing himself from the burden of hatred, not about absolving her of responsibility. I think I already have, he said finally, surprising himself with the realization. I'm still angry about what you did, still hurt by the betrayal. But I don't hate you, Camilla. I can't hate someone I loved for so long, regardless of what they've done. Tears ran down her face as she nodded gratefully. Thank you. That means more to me than you know. Charles leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, a gesture of farewell rather than reconciliation. Goodbye, Camilla. I hope you find peace. Take care of yourself, Charles. Take care of the children. And try to remember the good times we had along with the bad. The drive back to the airport was conducted in silence, Charles lost in thoughts that would take months to process fully. He had achieved the closure he had sought, but it came with a deeper understanding of human complexity that was both comforting and disturbing. 6 weeks later, Charles received word that Camilla had died peacefully in her sleep. There was no public announcement, no state funeral, no official acknowledgement of her passing. She simply disappeared from the world as quietly as she had been living in it. But, in the privacy of his study at Clarence House, Charles said a prayer for the woman who had been the great love and great tragedy of his life. He prayed for her peace, for his own healing, and for the strength to carry on with the duties that had outlasted their relationship. The monarchy would survive, as it always had. But the man who wore the crown would carry the scars of this experience for the rest of his reign, a reminder that even love, even devotion, could not always overcome the human capacity for deception and betrayal. In the end, Charles realized that might be the most valuable lesson of all for a king who ruled over a nation of flawed and complicated people just like himself.